So again, just to welcome you to this event, co-hosted by the UCD Equality Studies Centre and the UCD Centre for Gender, Feminisms and Sexualities. My name is Marie Moran. I'm Director of the Equality Studies Centre and I'm your chair for today. So we're really pleased to welcome Professor Alison Phipps today, who will speak to us on the topic From Me Not You to All of Us, an intersectional approach to tackling sexual violence. Alison has worked for many years in this field, both publishing really important pieces of scholarship, including her recent book, Me Not You, The Trouble with Mainstream Feminism, as well as working as an activist in the movement against sexual violence. She is currently co-leading the UK's Feminist Gender Equality Network's Gender-Based Violence Group. And with some others, she's just launched a new scholar activist collective called Abolition Feminism for Ending Sexual Violence. As many in the audience today will know, the topic of gender-based and sexual violence has really moved centre stage in Ireland in recent months, following the huge public outcry surrounding the murder of Aisling Murphy. In many respects, this horrendous event and the public and political response to it have followed patterns in the UK surrounding the murder of Sarah Everard. But of course, many activists have worked on the question of sexual violence in an Irish context for a long time before this, raising issues that are only partially heard and acknowledged, never mind addressed. We thought that International Women's Day 2022 was a good day to advance this public conversation in a way that is committed to moving beyond carceral and mainstream feminisms towards more emancipatory approaches that seek to end all forms of sexual and related violence against all the groups that are harmed, not only by the violence itself, but by some of the mainstream approaches to challenging it. So some housekeeping before we begin. Alison is going to speak for approximately 35 minutes. Is that right, Alison? Yeah, give or take, that's fine. And then we should have at least half an hour for a discussion. We need to wrap up at 1:15, pretty sharpish, given other commitments everybody has today. Now, in the discussion, please raise your hand if you would like to speak or ask a question using the raise hand function in Zoom. You may alternatively write your question in the chat, or if you prefer to remain anonymous, that's fine. You can write it privately to me or to Anne Woolhall, my co-host, who I'm sorry, Anne, I should have introduced you at the start. And hopefully I'll see it, or Anne will see it, and we can read it out. Please keep yourself muted unless you're speaking, and please do not speak unless called upon, as this is important for managing a group discussion of this size. So I'm going to hand over to Alison now. Thank you so much, Alison.
Just unmuting myself. Thank you so much, Marie, and thank you for inviting me to speak on International Women's Day. It feels really special. It's a real honour to be asked. As Marie has said, this lecture is about my book, which is called Me Not You, The Trouble with Mainstream Feminism, and that came out with Manchester University Press in April 2020. The book's about mainstream white feminism, particularly in Britain and the US, and how this is shaped more broadly by the role of white women in white supremacy. I kind of have this idea that you're better than us in Ireland, but hopefully this will have some kind of resonances with you, especially given the recent murder of Aisling Murphy and the parallels between that and the case of Sarah Everard. So my book focuses on campaigns against sexual violence, and it takes the recent viral Me Too movement as its starting point. And my argument in a nutshell is that Me Too can become me, not you, a lot of the time. So the book has an intersectional framework. It's heavily influenced by Black feminism and other feminisms of colour. I draw on writers, thinkers and activists, including Angela Davis, Audre Lorde, Patricia Hill Collins, Mariam Kaba, Maria Lugones, Sarah Ahmed, Gargi Bhattacharya, and many others. And understanding sexual violence intersectionally means not only paying attention to the multiple relationships between vulnerability and inequality, but also asking what sexual violence does within intersecting systems. So what's the role of sexual violence in both the sexual contract and the racial colonial contract? How does it prop up heteropatriarchy and colonial racial capitalism? How does it support the racing of gender and the gendering of race? Me Not You came out in April 2020, as I've said, which was near the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. And much mainstream commentary on COVID-19 argued that it exposed the flaws of the capitalist system. But this system isn't broken. It functions exactly as designed. And what the pandemic exposed was its cruelty, especially of the neoliberal iteration that has depleted health, social care, and welfare systems and devolved responsibility onto private households and armies of low-paid and migrant workers who were often denied healthcare themselves. Almost 6 million people across the world have died of COVID. Many have been marginalized by race, class, disability, or age, or a combination. Many have been impoverished. Many have been from the global south. Many have been from migrant and displaced populations. Some have been homeless. Some have been incarcerated. So globally, nationally, and locally, the pandemic threw into sharp relief what Patricia Hill Collins calls the matrix of domination, through which intersecting oppressions allocate quality of life and risk of premature death differently within and between populations and within and between countries. It's reiterated that capitalism will stop at nothing to preserve itself, and that the state functions not to take care of us, but to take care of the market, although for a short state socialist moment in some countries, the two crossed paths. As Nicholas de Geneva has argued, the mass death of COVID-19 was produced not just by the virus, but by our own socio-political arrangements. And these are necropolitical arrangements in which marginalized populations are governed through negligence and neglect. COVID-19 also made explicit the fact that those who do the work of preserving life are both essential and disposable at the same time. And this presents a paradox: the antagonistic yet dependent relationship between capital and human existence. Power over life is indispensable to capitalism, and this involves the management of bodies, the disposal of some, and the reliance on others to biologically and socially reproduce living labor. These processes are all facilitated by sexual violence. I theorize sexual violence as a pivot for the systems of heteropatriarchy and colonial racial capitalism. It upholds the purloining of free social reproduction. It supports the extraction of hyper-exploited labor, the expropriation of land and resources, and the disposal of those deemed not to matter. It keeps gendered, racialized, and colonized populations in line through dehumanization and violation. And this happens at the level of the individual, the household, the community, the nation state, and the world, and operates along 4 vectors: threats, acts, imputations, and punishment. I argue that these must be considered together if we are to understand why sexual violence occurs and how to stop it. So acts and threats of sexual violence keep women in our place and punish gender non-conforming people, preserving binary gender as the condition for social reproduction at no or low cost. Silvia Federici's work on the European witch hunts shows how central violence against women was to the imposition of capitalism. There's evidence that sexual violence was not so prevalent in societies in which production didn't rely on exploitative gender relations. Europe before the Neolithic agricultural revolution and pre-colonial indigenous societies. In her book, The Beginning and End of Rape, Sarah Deer argues that rape, like patriarchy, was largely a European import to the Americas. Historical records affirm significant anti-rape sentiment in Native American cultures. Even Europeans who wrote disparagingly about Native people, Deer writes, noted that they abhorred sexual violence. So acts and threats of sexual violence then also support colonial systems in which land and labor is violently extracted from racialized communities. The colonial imaginary was profoundly sexually violent, and McClintock describes how the unknown world was mapped via a metaphysics of gender violence in which it was feminized and spatially spread for male exploration. Sexual violence was a key weapon in the colonial arsenal, perpetrated against indigenous and enslaved women and children in residential schools. It was a form of terrorism and a method of ethnic cleansing, either through the forced production of children or through preventing women from reproducing due to trauma. Furthermore, as women's bodies were colonized by sexual violence, men's bodies were colonized by imputations of it. So imputations of sexual violence and the threat or practice of punishment terrorize and dispose of populations surplus to capitalist requirements. As Cedric Robinson writes, colonialism required the notion of the savage, which was based on the idea of sexual threat. Sex, sexuality, and sexual violence were all key to the construction of race. From colonial genocide to slavery to lynching, the pretext of protecting women, or more precisely protecting white women, was central. And this continues to construct individuals, communities, cultures, and nations as dangerous in multiple and interlocking ways. It underpins neo-colonial dispossession and military industrial expansion, border regimes of many kinds, and the swelling prison industrial complex. What Gargi Bhattacharya calls the edge populations of capitalism are both created by sexual violence and constructed as a threat. And in all these ways, sexual violence is fundamental to racial capitalism and how it achieves its divide and rule. And like COVID-19, sexual violence ravages marginalized populations, but none of us are immune. Can you see the next bit of my slide there? I've got, oh yeah, that's right. Good. So for many white Western feminists, COVID-19 highlighted how fragile gains in gender equality are. Women found our care burdens growing heavier, with children sent home from school and family members becoming sick or passing away. Women working in more marginal economic sectors, especially hospitality, childcare, and retail, lost their jobs. Women, many of them working class, migrant, Black or other women of colour, were overrepresented amongst the frontline nurses and care workers dying of the virus. Violence against women and girls increased. The UN called it a shadow pandemic, as shelters and helplines across the world reported increasing calls, often from women in lockdown with their abusers. These developments expose the limitations of mainstream feminism, which tends to seek justice, equality, and power within the status quo rather than building alternatives. Nancy Fraser, Tithi Bhattacharya, and Cinzia Aruzza have called this equal opportunity domination. Audre Lorde might call it using the master's tools. So this is corporate feminism, which we've seen a lot of this International Women's Day, and the governance feminism that has put femocrats in local, national, and international bureaucracies. This feminism advocates for women on banknotes, but doesn't dispute the hands the majority of those banknotes are in. It leans into both market fundamentalism and the punitive state. And as I argue in Me Not You, concentrating on getting power rather than dismantling it, pulling the levers of existing systems means that what we gain today, we can lose by tomorrow. The COVID pandemic made it clear that despite decades of formal gender equality in many parts of the world, the underlying divisions of social reproduction persist. These divisions are gendered, classed, and raced, and as white bourgeois women sheltered at home, the more marginalized people who keep society running were defined as essential and marked as disposable, exposed to increased risk of infection and death. They were also exposed to new forms of criminalization and police violence. Stop and search powers were intensified and lockdowns brutally enforced. So while ordinary life was suspended for some, the everyday business of criminal punishment continued or increased for others. And on May the 25th, 2020, Minnesota police officer Derek Chauvin murdered George Floyd by kneeling on his neck. The same day in Central Park, Amy Cooper, a white woman, called the police on birdwatcher Christian Cooper, a Black man, no relation, because he asked her to put her dog on a lead. She said, "There's an African-American man threatening my life." This was a threat in itself to get Christian Cooper killed by a cop in a country in which, as Ronaldo Walcott writes, Black people experience the police as a foreign and occupying force. And as the video of this incident circulated alongside footage of George Floyd's murder, white women were confronted by our deep complicity with racial capitalist violence. This complicity, I argue in Me Not You, often takes the form of victimhood. Amy Cooper exercised it consciously and deliberately, like Carolyn Bryant, whose false allegation justified the brutal lynching of Emmett Till, 14-year-old Emmett Till, in 1955. Jessie Daniels has called Bryant the foremother of contemporary white women who call the police on Black people sitting in a Starbucks, barbecuing in a park, or napping in a dorm, what Walcott terms white deputization, and which also provokes fatal violence. But white women's genuine experiences of victimization, and crucially, how the mainstream feminist movement seeks protection and redress, must also be examined in the context of the intersecting systems of heteropatriarchy and colonial racial capitalism. So Me Not You is about the violence we can do in the name of fighting sexual violence. It's grounded in a historical and ongoing fact. Protecting white womanhood really means protecting racial capitalism and white supremacy. Bourgeois white women claim protection that has always been predicated on Black death and the deaths of other marginalized people. This is what links George Floyd with Amy Cooper, and uncomfortably, it's also what links Amy Cooper with the recent viral iteration of Me Too. I developed my analysis of the mainstream feminist movement through the concept of political whiteness, building on Daniel Martinez-Hosang, Gaminda Bambra, and others. This isn't about skin color or identity, but about investments in white supremacy, proximity to power and resources, and modes of politics. This isn't about bad or good people, but about how structures reproduce themselves through our actions. I argue that political whiteness is common to politics dominated by white people. It links mainstream feminism and the backlash against it, and it links more reactionary forms of feminism with the far right. It has three core components that are both ideological and affective: narcissism, an alertness to threat, and a will to power, often sated by proxy via state or institutional discipline. So mainstream white feminism is individualistic and self-regarding. My victimization, or the victimization of people like me, is central. And to explore this, I draw on understandings of whiteness as the experience of a world being made in one's own image, as well as the wealth of evidence of Black and other marginalized women being spoken over in mainstream feminism. I draw on Black feminist and post-colonial critiques of how white feminism makes universalizing claims based on the particular experiences of bourgeois white women. The one-dimensionality of white feminism allows it to operate with a gendered binary between victims, women, and perpetrators, men. And in all its spheres of operation, for instance, in relation to workplace equality and reproductive rights, as well as sexual violence, it centers and only tends to benefit middle-class white women who are not marginalized on axes other than gender. This one-dimensional framing carries through into the pursuit of solutions, which are usually based on criminal punishment or institutional or organizational discipline. Mainstream feminism tends to invest trauma or anger in what I call the media outrage economy through naming and shaming perpetrators. It equates criminal punishment with justice and safety and has strong attachments to the expressive function of the law. However, even a cursory glance at the history and political economy of carceral systems tells us they weren't developed to keep us safe, but to preserve state and elite interests, protect private property and resources, dispose of economically surplus populations, and ultimately ensure that racial capitalism functions unabated. The logic of law and order, developed through colonialism, manufactures consent through protection, and white women have always been central to this agenda. When mainstream feminism calls for criminal punishment, it sees itself as punching up at powerful white men. But in doing that, it legitimates systems that have been designed to absolve these men and intensify their power by punching down on more marginalized people. So how many women did it take to convict Harvey Weinstein and Larry Nassar? How many women have made sexual assault allegations against Donald Trump? The 2020 US presidential election featured two men who have both been credibly accused of sexual misconduct and assault. Meanwhile, prisons in England and Wales, the US and other countries are disproportionately filled with Black people and other people of colour. In the words of Ruha Benjamin, innocence and criminality are not objective states of being, but categories created against a backdrop of racialization and colonial violence. And as Dean Spade writes, prison itself is a form of gender and sexual violence. Sexual assault is rife in prisons, and the destruction of bodily boundaries involved in criminal punishment mirrors the experience of rape. White women are right to be angry about sexual violence. Anger has a long and productive history in Black feminism and other feminisms of colour, and Sara Ahmed in particular has written powerfully about reclaiming the charge of willfulness. But when filtered through race and class supremacy and satiated by proxy via the state, anger may become something quite different. Our right-moving world centres white anger, the anger of those who've lost privileges and entitlements, or who feel left behind and are blaming the wrong people. This is the anger of white men and some white women too. Far-right politics shows us what happens when anger is produced by and channeled through race and class supremacy. Now, I'm not equating this with white women's anger about sexual violence, but I am suggesting that our positionality means our anger may not always be as radical or transgressive as we might like. Alison Jagger calls feminist anger an outlaw emotion, but in the symbolic game of cops and robbers, we're often identified with the cops. We're right to be angry about sexual violence. Survivors have a right to spaces without abusers. Many survivors fantasize about revenge. Me Not You asks, whose bodies are forfeit when we mobilize punitive state and institutional power to achieve it? So Me Too has been described as a war against sexual violence. Me Not You asks, what's the collateral damage? And this is framed by much bigger questions. Which lives are to be defended at all costs? Which lives are to be protected in the service of defending the system? Which lives are already meant to be lost? I argue that marginalized communities who are targets of state violence and lower status women who we might pass our harassers on to become collateral of the mainstream feminist movement. Sexual violence is a pivot for the systems of heteropatriarchy and colonial racial capitalism. The acts and threats that keep us afraid, that make us docile subjects of capitalism, also drive us into the arms of the carceral colonial state and enable many other kinds of violence in the service of capitalist accumulation. And by pulling the levers of carceral systems, white feminism is a willing participant in this racial capitalist protection racket. In the process, it treats more marginalized groups as disposable. And this is how Me Too becomes Me Not You. So mainstream feminism isn't broken. It's functioning exactly as it's meant to, as an advocacy movement for members of the racially and economically dominant class. We might say Black Lives Matter, but we're deeply invested in the systems that demand and deliver Black demise. Going back to Ruha Benjamin, she argues that white safety is predicated on Black containment. And mainstream feminism's dominant mode of operation, in which state power is the route to redressing personal harms, means it can easily become reactionary. This can mean calling for more police, more prisons and harsher sentences, what Elizabeth Bernstein calls carceral feminism. It can also mean turning marginalized people into enemies if they disagree. And the last part of Me Not You explores how trans-exclusionary and anti-sex work feminism takes political whiteness a step further. This relentless activism moves from white ignorance, understood as the structural and sometimes willful non-knowing of mainstream feminism, into a politics with hostile and destructive intent. Anti-trans and anti-sex work feminisms are concerned with ownership of womanhood and the right subject of feminism, And like colonial racial capitalism itself, they draw on imputations of sexual violence as tools of dominance and exclusion. Men's violence against women is projected onto women defined as other, and these othered women, themselves at high risk of violence and abuse, are remade as representatives of patriarchy in order to be demonized and shut out. For some reactionary feminists, this appears to be what Malkia Davich-Cyril calls a triggered posture born of trauma, while others seem to have more self-serving motivations. Reactionary feminism is a case study in how violence can be an enactment of both supremacy and trauma at the same time. In anti-trans feminism, trans women are made responsible for acts of violence committed by cis men through narratives that naturalize the penis as violence and stick this organ to the trans woman via an invasive obsession with her surgical status. In anti-sex worker feminism, sex workers are vilified as handmaidens of the patriarchy who commodify their own bodies and thus expose all women to objectification and abuse. This is a territorial claim to victimhood on behalf of real women, defined as both natural and respectable and implicitly coded as white. And this territorial victimhood is easily threatened, either by the claims of other liberation movements or by attempts to highlight intersecting structural advantages, for instance, on the basis of class and/or race, both of which are interpreted individualistically as a denial of reactionary feminists' gendered victimization. This has caused reactionary feminists to attack the principle of intersectionality, and in some cases has led them to support far-right denunciations of gender studies and critical race theory. Flavia Zodan, who coined the now famous phrase, "My feminism will be intersectional or it will be bullshit," has written that such Victorian feminist attacks on intersectionality reflect the anxieties of bourgeois white women faced with ideas and politics generated by former subjects of empire. Continuing the long history of imperial, eugenicist, and conservative brands of white feminism, contemporary reactionary feminism has a deeply colonial mindset that reflects whiteness as the experience of and desire to reproduce a world made in one's own image. It continues the legacy of respectable femininity as a tool of capitalist and colonial domination. Reactionary feminism has ideological continuities with Brexit and other right-wing populist movements. In a world where gender equality is under threat, it foregrounds a white womanhood attempting to preserve its own position by punching down on degenerate sisters. In the context of enforced economic scarcity that characterizes neoliberal capitalism, it claims resources and support for the good women rather than the bad. In an age of widespread precarity, even amongst those whose geographical location and race and class positionality might previously have protected them from it, reactionary feminists may feel they are taking back control. But like the taking back control of Brexit, this has deeply harmful consequences. Sex workers are criminalized and endangered by policies that purport to protect other women from sexual objectification and abuse. Trans women are denied access to the spaces they need for validation and help, or prevented from simply getting on with their lives, for instance, by going to the bathroom. We might see reactionary feminism as a form of hoarding the wages of whiteness, which draws powerfully on the tropes of whiteness under threat that have such power with the resurgent far right. The symbolic and material bordering of reactionary feminism aligns with the contemporary border regimes now asserting and reasserting themselves on the far right, which position gender as a repository for a cluster of resentments and fears. As Judith Butler recently argued, gender is now linked with all kinds of imagined infiltrations of the national body. Trans exclusionary feminism especially, animated by the fear of being overrun, has much in common with conservatives who argue that increased immigration will result in increased rape. In the contemporary culture wars, trans exclusionary feminism circulates alongside other forms of white identity politics and conspiracy theories, legitimated and mainstreamed under the banner of free speech and debate, and attractive to those casting about for someone to blame. Dystopian fantasies of female and lesbian erasure sit alongside the Islamophobic conspiracy of the Great Replacement and the anti-Semitic spectre of white genocide. And incidentally, there's also a theory that trans activism is being funded by George Soros. There are significant and growing associations between reactionary feminists and far-right groups. Trans exclusionary feminism in particular has become part of the Christian rights agenda to divide and rule the LGBT community by separating the T from the LGB. In the US, trans exclusionary feminists have partnered with the US National Catholic Bioethics Center, the American College of Pediatricians, which is an anti-LGBT group not to be confused with the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Alliance Defending Freedom, and the Heritage Foundation. In Britain, the Institute of Race Relations recently warned that so-called gender-critical feminism was playing directly into the hands of the far right. Groups and individuals such as English Defence League founder Tommy Robinson, Smash Cultural Marxism, and Patriotic Alliance are increasingly pushing the narrative that trans women are a violent threat to cis women and children. The reactionary feminists who associate with these far-right groups seem happy to be treated as property by men who reserve their own rights to perpetrate abuse. As a war on women rages worldwide, some reactionary feminists have joined forces with those waging it to pursue parochial territorial concerns. But like the generations of colonizers before them who've professed a concern for women's safety only when it serves their quest for domination, these friends of reactionary feminism will turn out to be enemies in the end. The crusade against gender ideology is ultimately a crusade against all sexual and gender minorities, against feminism, against reproductive rights, and against women. And in Hungary, Poland, and Russia, attacks on trans rights have quickly broadened along these lines. This reveals a process of closing doors against, expelling, or assimilating anyone who dares to produce, reproduce, or think differently. It means reasserting geographical and ideological borders, defending the cis, white, enabled, economically productive, and heterosexually reproductive capitalist body against those on the outside. Reactionary feminists act as human shields for this process, cloaked in the garb of damsels in distress. And in doing this, reactionary feminists trade freedom for an experience of safety, which is temporary at best. As the recent murder of Sarah Everard showed, the men who purport to protect us also reserve the right to abuse and kill us themselves. For me, these alliances bring to mind Patricia Hill Collins' article, Learning from the Outsider Within, in which she reproduces a quote from an interview conducted by John Gwaltney with 73-year-old Nancy White, who says, "My mother used to say that the black woman is the white man's mule and the white woman is his dog. Now, she said that to say this: we do the heavy work and get beat whether we do it well or not. But the white woman is closer to the master and he pats them on the head and lets them sleep in the house, but he ain't going to treat neither one like he was dealing with a person." As Hill Collins explains, the white woman may feel she is part of the family when in fact she is a well-cared-for pet. So these bourgeois white women experience the necropolitical rage of white men as vicarious power in the form of protection, when ultimately they too are property to be abused at will, but defended violently from the others. In this way, reactionary feminism bolsters its proponents' race and class supremacy and all women's gendered subordination. Reactionary feminists in England and Scotland have attacked rape crisis centres with trans-inclusive policies and have used the right-wing media to stoke fear about women's services, even though the vast majority are successfully trans-inclusive. They've waged a successful campaign against the charity Stonewall, causing government departments, the BBC, universities and other organisations to withdraw from its Diversity Champion scheme, which promotes LGBT inclusion in the workplace. So there's no world building here, there's just tearing down. The wrecking ball of reactionary feminism is launched by its focus on safety to the detriment of solidarity, and its demand for safety for some at the expense of others is rooted in the myopia of mainstream white feminism. This plays directly into how racial capitalism defeats resistance through fragmentation. It's become part of a tremendous backlash as the system attempts to reassert itself in the face of demands by marginalized groups for equality on their own terms. I don't want to spend too long being sidetracked by what can never be constructive engagement with reactionary feminism. I trace its political action and underpinning assumptions, but have no desire to engage with its arguments. The endless cycles of recrimination on social media provide a quick hit of satisfaction, but don't deepen our politics. The bad blood that currently exists between reactionary feminists and their opponents echoes the 1980s feminist sex wars. There are generational dynamics at play here, as well as very different visions of feminism. These arguments also betray different orientations to human existence itself. Do we live with openness and creativity? Do we look to the future with hope, a sense of possibility around gender, sex, and sexuality, and ambitions to end sexual violence? Or do we remain stagnant, jealously guarding our victimhood and demanding that the status quo fortify itself to serve us better in our desires for protection and revenge? I'm interested in future tense politics, which requires us to know our history, but not to live in it. In contrast to reactionary feminism's destructive hoarding of protection, its carceral splitting into deserving and undeserving, a feminist politics which truly aimed to end sexual violence would be generous, not just focused on me or you, but concerned with all of us. Its framework would be broad, not limited by existing realities, and certainly not defined by using the right hand of patriarchy against the left. What Angela Davis calls abolition feminism starts with a comprehensive understanding of violence, connecting interpersonal violence with state violence, with the violence of war and borders, with violence against the planet. What I take from this in relation to sexual violence is that we need to hold all four vectors together: acts, threats, imputations, and punishment, and work to dismantle all the ways they prop up the intersecting systems of heteropatriarchy and colonial racial capitalism. For mainstream white feminism, this means refusing protection predicated on Black death, refusing to be a pretext for state and community violence against more marginalized people. This broader understanding of violence also requires a capacious notion of care, much needed in a mean and grudging neoliberal world in which we're constantly told there's not enough. This is the opposite to the preoccupation with scarcity that drives reactionary feminism, and an antidote to how racial capitalism individualizes us and puts us in competition while co-opting and commodifying our resistance. This is a way of life already imagined by many marginalized communities, some of whom have led mutual aid efforts in response to COVID-19. In their care manifesto, the Care Collective call this promiscuous care. They describe it as an ethics that proliferates outwards to redefine caring relations from the most intimate to the most distant. It means caring more and in ways that remain experimental and extensive by current standards. In other words, moving from me, not you to all of us means broadening the circle of what and who we care about, creating what Mignolo calls cultures of care for life that incorporate the solidarity and reciprocity missing from both mainstream and reactionary feminisms. It means queering notions of care beyond the heteronormative nuclear family. These conceptions of violence and care are expansive, but while thinking big, we can act small. In this, the abolitionist concept of non-reformist reforms is incredibly useful. Non-reformist reforms are realistic measures that move us towards what Mariam Kaba calls the horizon of abolition, resisting the binary between reform and revolution and helping build our radical imaginations. They're not tailored to or co-optable by the current system, but make cracks in it and try to halt cycles of violence. They're not handed down from above, but built from below as part of broader programs and strategies. It will take time and experimentation to establish what non-reformist reforms are in relation to ending sexual violence. It's clear that we're not looking for more police on the streets, new crimes and longer sentences. Instead, we should be looking at race-informed bystander and crisis intervention, community safety and support, emergency housing, and the repeal of laws that criminalise survival. There are no quick and easy answers, although COVID-19 has brought essential questions into sharper relief. We need to resist the neoliberal demand for speed and off-the-shelf solutions, and as Sarah Lamble writes, abolition is an ongoing process and practice. COVID has also reiterated our profound interdependence as a species and the profound sickness of the world systems we live in. As Adrienne Marie Brown puts it, supremacy is our ongoing pandemic. The mass disenfranchisement and consumerist politics of neoliberalism has already been shaken by the many protest movements which have sprung up over the last decade. Their demands to abolish police and prisons, borders and billionaires, to return stolen land and end climate emergency also prefigure a world without sexual violence. This is what Angela Davis calls the intersectionality of struggles, which means we're all in this together. And because we're all in this together, mainstream feminists need to stop pursuing actions that treat more marginalized groups as disposable. I end Me Not You with a quote from Audre Lorde. This question was posed in her 1981 keynote speech at the US National Women's Studies Association conference. She asked, "What woman here is so enamored of her own oppression that she cannot see her heel print on another woman's face?" Over 40 years later, this question is still crucially relevant to the mainstream feminist fight against sexual violence. And this is a very good place to stop my presentation. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry, I just want to put my arrows on.
Thank you so much, Alison. That was really powerful and invigorating and challenging, mobilizing, and I hope empowering for many of us here. I certainly felt a whole range of feelings and thoughts listening to you speak. So thank you so much. You really revealed so much of what remains hidden or what tries to remain hidden within mainstream feminism. So thank you for that too.
Thank you.
I think we're going to move to a discussion. People might need to take a minute or two to collect their thoughts. We might stop sharing the screen so that we can see each other. If you want to ask a question, if you can please raise your hand, and myself or Anne Mulhall, who's co-hosting today, and you should see both of us at the top of your screen, we'll unmute you. And if you want to turn on your camera, you're very welcome to. We wanted to have this in kind of the ordinary Zoom discussion room rather than in the webinar room, because it's kind of closer to being in a room together rather than sort of behind these different walls. So do feel free to join in whatever way feels right for you. So I'll give you a second to gather your thoughts and see who'd like to start. People are feeling shy on internet.
It's awful on Zoom though, isn't it? I never ask a question on Zoom.
Yeah, and you're just so clear, Alison. I'm sure people are really just trying to formulate a question that is as clear as how you've delivered all those really important points.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you. I mean, we can just have a chat if you like as well. I would like to know how this resonates with you as Irish feminists. That's a question I have for all of you. If it resonates, and if it does, how it resonates, or what's different, I mean, I'm just remembering that brilliant letter that was sent by Irish feminists to trans exclusionary feminists when they wanted to come and talk in Ireland, which ended, "We've had enough of colonialism in Ireland without having more of it from you," which just filled my heart with joy. So yeah, what about this kind of resonates with you, and what doesn't?
I think we don't have the same level of problems with trans exclusionary feminists here. context, I think, which isn't to say it isn't there in kind of public or mainstream discourse, but I think within anything that could be called an Irish feminist movement, it's definitely not as much of a difficulty as it is in the UK. And in the chat saying, yeah, we're lucky not to have turfs here, but we need to be wary it doesn't take hold.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of spreading around Europe now, isn't it? A bit more. Yeah.
So hopefully you can see your raise hand function if you have that. Yeah. So Julia, I think I'm going to ask you to unmute. Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you for the lovely chat. I really enjoyed your book and quoted it in my master's thesis. So big fan here. I'm currently looking into sort of Eastern European women migrants and their experiences, and I've read sort of the Patricia Hill Collins and the sort of African American intersectional approach, which is fascinating and very applicable. But I mean, it's still sort of a different cup of tea to some extent, and I'm sort of wondering where do you see these women who are sort of white but not quite white enough, and privileged or not, where do they sort of fit in?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's sort of why I mean, I called it political whiteness, and I'm not sure whether I will hang on to that. It seemed like a good idea at the time because there was a lot of discussion of white feminism, but I would never want to essentialize that in particular types of bodies, because it's not. It's a mode of operation and it's a type of feminism, and it's also very much about class privilege and geographical privilege, as well as everything else. And it's these women, these Eastern European migrants certainly would be one of the groups situated as collateral by mainstream white feminism. So I think that their whiteness doesn't fit into my analysis in that way. I don't know whether you've read Akugo Amajulo's work on women of colours activism in Europe, because that might be quite useful for you. There's a book called To Exist is to Resist, which she co-edited with Leah Bassel, which is really wonderful. And might give you a nice framework, for taking some of that intersectionality into the European context, because that's the other thing about intersectionality. It's come out of the US. So there are certain things that you need to make it work to do.
Yeah, this is great. I'll look into it for sure. Thank you.
I can put her name in the chat if you like.
That's great. Thank you both. We have a question from Carly Bailey. You want to go ahead and speak?
Hi, yeah, this is really great. I've really enjoyed it. It's kind of a refreshing way to spend International Women's Day. It's not the usual way. I suppose there's a couple of things that I suppose really forced us, and as you said, Marie, it's kind of challenging, particularly over the last year or so. I suppose recently, obviously, the Ashley Murphy murder, which has mobilized people here, and yet the murder of, I think she was a Malaysian woman, the year before, got little to no attention whatsoever. And that, I think that definitely comes back to sort of a person in our own image and how that manifests. And then I suppose more recently with what's happening in Ukraine, and we know that I think it's like 80% of displaced people are women and children, and rightfully so. Ireland and other countries are going to accept people leaving, maybe around about 100,000 people, and yet, and we're told it's exceptional circumstances, it's war. And yet we only took in 500 people from Afghanistan and, loads of other countries. So there's a lot of it really very obviously that sort of heel print on people's faces in front of us. And yet there's little to no discussion around it. It still continues to be pension, wage gaps, gender pay, and all of those things are important and all of that. But I don't know. And I suppose I'm one of those people who I'm in a sort of a position of power. I'm a counsellor. Don't have very much power at all whatsoever, but I'm in a sort of the system, I suppose you could argue, of 40 in a room where there's one person of colour, and nobody, very few, anything from other backgrounds. It's just, and I've always found that a struggle and a challenge. And I suppose my question around that is, how do we challenge that system? How do we build that alternative? I know I can't do much within the system. I'm very aware of that now at this stage. So what do we need to be doing to build that solidarity and challenge the status quo? I guess that's a big question. Yeah, I want you to answer that in 30 seconds.
I don't know.
But thanks
Why are
ever
you
so much.
asking me?
Really enjoyed this. No, really enjoyed this. So it's great.
Thank you so much. I mean, I am working on a resource at the moment, which might be of interest to you, Carly, and maybe other people as well, which is about what would non-reformist reforms or what would abolitionist steps look like in relation to sexual violence. So I don't know whether you've seen some of those things that have been circulating, especially after George Floyd's murder, around defunding the police and kind of trying to assess, you know, because the trouble with reform is that it can often just bolster the system in different ways, can't it? It's just a way of polishing it up, as Sarah Ahmed would say. So these resources around police reform were about kind of which reforms actually work towards divesting the police of some of their power, and which reforms are what we would call a reformist reform, which is actually a way of bolstering the system. And with the group Abolitionist Futures, I'm currently working on a resource around sexual violence, which asks those very practical questions. So, I mean, some of it is about kind of, does this centre the police and the criminal punishment system as the answer? Some of it is about asking, does this increase the capacities of institutions to perpetrate harm, or does it increase their capacities to help? And the big question, I guess, is, does this protect one group at the expense of others? And we're trying to kind of assess different things, like different legal proposals, bystander intervention, kind of crisis response with those questions. So I think I don't have an answer to your question, but I think that is the right question. And I think that is the question we all need to be asking ourselves and each other, and sort of working together on it. And I have big sympathy for anybody trying to work within the system, because I did that in universities for years. You know, 16 years I tried to work within universities on ending sexual violence, equality and diversity. And to be honest, I'm sort of done. But I respect anybody who stays. And I think that that's something that we need to do. We need more of this. We need more groups of women, and especially women with a bit of power and a bit of leverage, to think through these really difficult questions. You know, does this ultimately do more harm than good? So yes, that's not an answer, but keep your eyes peeled, because we will be sharing our resource. And I've just set up this group at Newcastle called Abolition Feminism for Ending Sexual Violence. Those are some of the questions we're going to be looking at as well. It's open to anyone. If you want to join, then drop me an email. I will just put my email in the chat.
That's fantastic, Alison. Thank you very much.
I'm misspelling my own name. There we go. Yeah, email me if you want to join it, because you know, we can work it out together.
Brilliant.
And we can give you some support maybe as well.
Thank you. I don't see a raised hand, so I'm going to do that chair thing and ask the question. I was wondering, please, if somebody raises a hand, let's cut me short. But I'm just interested in the recentering of violence, Alison. I suppose I'm used to reading feminist texts from a long way back, where violence was sort of the end point of other systems, you know, kind of cultural, economic, political, nearly like an after effect that happened when things get really bad. But I'm reminded of other feminists who I've read throughout the years who've always had violence right at the center. Like, I think violence was one of Sylvia Walby's early structures of patriarchy, and then it's one of Iris Marin Young's 5 Faces of Oppression, and then more recently I was very struck by Judith Butler's Ethics on Violence, which kind of flips it a bit, but she talks about the social bonds of humanity that are the heart of equality, and that violence just a direct repudiation of them. So I found it very interesting in your approach, because you talk about that violence as a pivot for all other systems that I think we're much more used to looking at on their own terms, and then seeing how they might produce violence in certain times and places.
Yes.
I wanted to say anything more about that, or maybe this is just a comment, something that I kind of was noting as you were talking.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've never thought of it that way before, but I guess that's what I am doing, is sort of recentering violence and seeing it not necessarily as a cause or an effect, but just asking the question of what it does. What does sexual violence do within these broader systems of oppression? And I think I got there through kind of my years of sexual violence activism, but also then through, becoming much more familiar with the Black Lives Matter movement in response to, well, obviously it has a much longer history, but the more recent iterations of it. And I think we do need to understand all of it together. So it's kind of recentering violence, but also having that broad understanding of violence, and understanding how these systems that perpetrate violence also tell us who the violent people are, so they can perpetrate more violence. Yeah. Oh, there's something in the chat.
Yeah. So I'm happy to read that. Everyone, so that's Sylvia has said, many thanks for the fascinating presentation. I was recently in a webinar on with women peace activists and feminists in Ukraine. I observed the strong rejection by some of them of the media depiction of racial prioritization of people at the Ukrainian-Polish border of white women and children over others trying to escape the conflict. Their main argument was that the border guards were just following a UN directive to prioritize women and children over anyone else. And this type of reporting simply promotes Putin's propaganda and does more harm than good. Any thoughts on how to engage with these types of debates, contributing from outside to local issues, would be much welcome. Thank you.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I don't think I can say anything kind of definitive about it. I don't know the Ukrainian context very well. I know basically what's going on and why, but I don't know the ins and outs of it. But I would say, anybody who claims there's no racism in their country, I would encourage them to look a little bit harder for that. I think what we can do as people who are outside of these debates is try to understand what's going on. And I think it's entirely possible that there is racism at the Ukrainian-Polish border, but also that racism is then being weaponized in the service of a broader agenda, and I think that's what we can do as feminists, and as feminists who are working against violence. We have to be able to have more than one thought at once, don't we? It's like the whole, you probably remember the whole thing around Julian Assange, which was, what was that, 10 years ago now? I think it's entirely possible that Assange did those things to women. I think it's also entirely possible that was weaponized, by various state actors who wanted to attack him. So I think we have to have more than two thoughts at once. We have to acknowledge that violence against women is a thing. We have to acknowledge that racism is a thing, but we also have to notice who's calling who violent and who's calling who racist. And we don't have to make we don't have to make a definitive conclusion about the truth of these claims. We have to look at what these claims do. There's no doubt that some trans women have been violent towards cis women. Of course they have. There's violence in every group. But we have to look at who's saying all trans women are violent in order to exclude them from women's spaces and women's prisons. So I think sometimes claims of violence or claims of racism or claims of something, sexism or whatever, can operate as a kind of black box to shut things down, can't they? And we have to resist that and think about how these get caught up in broader currents and dynamics. There's a hand up.
Great, thank you, Sylvia, and thanks, Alison. So Anne, our co-organizer, has a question.
Alison, thanks so much for your talk, which covered so much and I think really resonates with a lot a lot that's been happening in Ireland as well. You know, like there are unfortunately TERFs in Ireland. You know, there is a lot of the criminalization of sex workers here is a huge issue.
I was going to ask about that.
Yeah, and also, you know, our issues around race and ethnicity. I suppose it was just a response a little bit to what Sylvia was saying, which is kind of shifting the ground of that. Like, I think most of us here have no way of knowing what's happening in Ukraine. I don't know the Ukrainian situation, but if you kind of switch the lens to looking at what our own government are doing in response and what that tells us, you know, about the broader kind of European and EU border practices, you know, the fact that the Irish government has, it seems, agreed to accept 100,000 people coming from Ukraine, and yet it was, I think, they were going to accept 2,000 people over the next 3 years as refugees before this. You know what I mean? So it's and that is most certainly around whiteness. You know, they've made it almost impossible for people looking to bring relatives over from Afghanistan to come over. The bar is set so high in terms of what people need to have in place financially and in terms of resources before they come. So there is undoubtedly a question here of racialization, and I think Harsha Walia's work around bordering practices, labor and whiteness is really important on this, you know. But like, I don't know, we have a huge shortfall here for people in the service industries, and most certainly I think Harsha Walia, looking at what's happening here and in other places in Europe, would join the dots around that as well. Do you know what I mean? That it's not entirely necessarily a kind of like a humanitarian sort of like gesture on the part of European governments either, you know what I mean? And something again that like reestablishes whiteness. Obviously everybody who needs to seek safety should be allowed into the country, right? But I've kind of lost my train of thought there slightly, sorry.
That's okay. No, I know what you mean, and it's not a race to the bottom, right? Is it? I mean, you know, yes, we should let all these Ukrainians in. We should let everybody in, let them all in all the time. Do you know what I mean? So it's kind of, I think what's useful about this actually, in some ways, is that it shows these governments can do it. It's the same as, you know, what happened during COVID and how, you know, we were under a socialist government for a few minutes, you know, in certainly in Britain when the furlough rules came in, and when the government was kind of issuing various forms of support for people. And I think Dean Spade's book, Mutual Aid, is really useful on this, where he sort of argues that that's really useful for us as activists, because it shows there is the money, there is the capacity, there are the systems, there is the will when it has to happen. And the same with the refugees. We should let all these people in from Ukraine, no doubt, but it also shows us that we can let, you know, people in. So I think that's the thing. It's about thinking about it in a more generous way, isn't it? You know, and thinking, well, you know, yes, they should have it, but so should everyone. I think it was from the Combahee River Collective Statement, which was kind of written in 1975, which, you know, argued that if you make things better for the people at the bottom of the tree, then it will get better for everyone. It's kind of like a trickle up type system. You know, if the world was right for people with the most to contend with, then it would be right for all of us. And I think COVID shows us that, doesn't it, as well?
Yeah, no, I think that's it. Just what it shows what governments can do if there's the will. Like, so there's talk of building modular homes for people who are coming, whereas people are still stuck in direct provision here, which is our form of incarceration of people seeking asylum. And nothing can be done for those people. But, you know, so it's like that kind of capturing this and somehow reversing it in a positive way.
We can use it, you know, we use it as leverage, you know, and that's one of the things that you can do within the system. I think when you see a crack in the system like that, when you see the system does work, you know, for some people and not others, then that's your in sometimes to say, well, why can't we do this for everybody?
Thank you both. There's a question coming in from Ailish. Bystander intervention aspect to the abolitionist futures, I think.
Yes.
More.
Yeah, so on the resource that we're developing about kind of what might be good things to support around sexual violence, we do have bystander intervention on the list, bystander intervention training, which kind of teaches you how to intervene in a situation. It might be in your workplace, or it might be just kind of out on the street or whatever, or it might be with your neighbours or what have you, and how to de-escalate things. And I think that can be really useful. I mean, we were a bit unsure about it in the sense of sometimes bystander intervention, you can worry that it just empowers people to be vigilantes. And then who gets defined as threatening and dangerous, and who can be a bystander? Obviously, that's very, very racialized. You know, and if you're a Black man intervening in something that's happening between, you know, say a white couple on the street and the police show up, who's the most likely to get arrested? Well, you are. So there are really important questions about who should be a bystander, and bystander intervention training needs to be very much race informed, I think, but it can be a good thing to do. And it's just building that capacity, you know, whether within institutions or organizations or communities, to stop things before they get worse. You know, I mean, I always think that with, you know, with Harvey Weinstein, or with some of these men who've just been exposed in the UK universities, what would have happened if what would have happened if early on somebody intervened, if they'd seen that behavior and said, look, this stops now, you know, you can't do this? What would have happened if the first person to report them had been believed and supported? And what would have happened if the community had actually come together and said, right, we're going to support you, who's experienced this, but we're also going to support you to stop doing this to people. So those are the types of things that we're sort of interested in exploring.
Thank you, Alison. I see Carly, you have your hand raised again. Because we're almost out of time, I just want to check, does anybody else who hasn't already spoken, would anybody else like to come in? Now's your moment. No, okay, so Carly, we'll go back to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I suppose one of the things I looked at my thesis there was around housing support for women experiencing violence, and I suppose the lack of, and I mean that's something that's experienced worldwide, I think. And I suppose for me, in terms of how do we not just stop it from happening, but how do we deal with the consequences of the violence, and for people feeling be able to feel safe to stay at home and not have to just be the one who has to leave all the time, and the supports that come around, the resources. I suppose that's something I'm still very interested in, because there is a huge lack of support, not believed, or they'll just go back to them. There's all this kind of thing. But I suppose in terms of community support and solidarity, I suppose the worry is that those organisations that are there to help, charities, for example, are reliant on state funding. Can't say very much, can't really criticise too much. We saw that more recently at the National Women's Council march at the weekend, where the government ministers and that weren't invited to be part of it, and it was almost like a threat of with withdrawal of funding as a result. Now, I wouldn't be a biggest fan of that particular organisation as a mainstream feminist group. They do their thing and that's fine, but I think it's been very prevalent that it's very difficult to help without the state funding. But how do we build that community solidarity, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I've been having that same conversation with lots of people from women's services recently. You know, how do we kind of divest from some of these sources of funding? How do we kind of use it for our own purposes, but also is there a way to divest from some of these funding streams which do lock you into particular ways of tackling things? And I don't have an answer to that either, but I think that is another question that's ongoing that we need to think about. I mean, I don't know whether kind of local work is less tightly controlled than national work, and that probably varies in different areas. I think in some parts of England there's quite a lot of leeway locally to do things. You know, you kind of get the funding, but you can kind of turn that to a different purpose, but that might be different in different parts of the country and in different countries of the UK as well. I mean, and in terms of community capacity, some of this I think is about just people, you know, people stepping up, and as Mariam Kaba says, everybody putting their small stone on the pile, because we don't have those community links or kind of capacities at the moment, although we did have them for a moment in COVID, didn't we? And it's interesting to see what we did in COVID, because I do think that, you know, as communities, we've become very isolated in a lot of ways as well. And in the world that we want to build, do we want to have just state agencies that look after us, or do we want to be all looking after each other and to have the time and resources to look after each other, which is difficult because that's not letting the state off the hook, but it's sort of saying that we need a different way of life in a way as well. So these are all really, really big questions, and I don't have any answers. The other thing about community, of course, is that you can romanticize community in various ways, and communities themselves are the sources of a lot of violence or of kind of closing ranks around abusers. So there's no sort of silver bullet, is there? Yeah, but these are really, I mean, I'm ongoing questions, and I'm really keen to kind of continue the discussion with anybody that wants to. Yeah, I mean, this is the way forward.
Yeah, I think that's really clear from your talk today, Alison, and thank you again so much. And I think everybody would probably like to join me in thanking you now for like just a fantastic talk. And I think I'm getting messages privately, and I think some of them are coming through in the group chat saying just how fantastic it has been.
Oh, that's lovely.
There it has been on International Women's Day, even though the topic is itself so difficult. I think there's a lot of hope in how you've approached it. And I think everybody's really feeling that. So we're really grateful to you, Alison, and thank you for all your amazing work. And I think you'll probably have some sign-ups to your Newcastle group from.
Oh, lovely. Yeah.
I would expect so. And to everybody who's been asking, yes, we will be posting this recording once we've done some short editing on the Equality Studies Centre website, and also I think on the Centre for Gender Feminisms and Sexualities website, so you can check back on those if you'd like to watch back on it, or share it yourselves. So that's it, everybody. Enjoy the rest of, or cope with the rest of International Women's Day, your perspective, and we'll see you all again soon. And thanks again to you, Alison, especially.
Thanks so much for having me. Take care.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.